Hey guys, Budcat7 here. Okay, it is Thursday, February 6, 2020, and I'd like to thank you for visiting the Stonewall Research Channel here on YouTube. Thank you very much. I really do appreciate it. All right, guys. Well, we're going to move forward in our series here looking at the quote-unquote giants or large hominids, as I like to call them, state by state. And in this video, we're going to cover Louisiana and Mississippi. And these are some very interesting accounts. And since I'm using the software here, there shouldn't be any issues or anything. There's no time constraints. So we can really look in depth at some of the details of these accounts. And that's often where the interesting things are found. Some of the accounts are just very basic, bare bones account, maybe 1, 2 lines, 3 lines of mention in some historical text or something like that, large scale remains found, whatever it is. So although it's noteworthy of, them accounting for this somewhere officially, which is the point, but it's, for our purposes here with these videos, only interested in the things that, seem unusual. So let's get into it here. We're going to start with Louisiana. So let's look at these accounts here. Large skull from the Mound or Latro Mound in Louisiana. Mr. Gaspard Coussacs exhibited the series of royal ordinances relating to Louisiana from 1725 to 1764 in perfect condition. Professor Bayer reported that Dr. Rudolph Modest, the highest local authority on craniology, advised that the Lardo Mound skull submitted to him for examination be forwarded to the scientific societies of Paris for their judgment upon it. Full text here. So the Smithsonian, it's mentioned in a Bureau of Ethnology report. That's why it's in here on the Greater Ancestors website here. And this is a PDF, but you can see the, file location for this PDF is Smithsonian. So it's a report from the Bureau of Ethnology of the Smithsonian, which, I went there and looked at the thing. It's just one of these reports where they mentioned this in it. Okay, so let's read this interesting article. This is very interesting, and this is about a major mound site there in Louisiana that was destroyed, folks. It had to be destroyed for a bridge construction project in 1931, and that would put us at the time of Roosevelt during the, WPA projects, etc. And this meant a lot of business there, a lot of jobs for people there, etc., etc. Just at that time, this guy, Alice Hurdlish, this loony, okay, because he was a lunatic, okay. C.W. Saram wrote about him being a nut job in his book, and Charles C. Mann wrote about him being a fruitcake in his book. Okay, so this guy, you look at the expression on this guy's face here, this guy was a lunatic, okay? And he's responsible for suppressing and omitting tons of archaeological evidence about this ancient civilization that went into the far distant past on this continent here. Okay, so you can thank him for that, and much of the stuff that he did in the Smithsonian just still stands today as if it was good information, and it's not, because of this punk. He's well admired within the Smithsonian circles there, but the guy was a crazy person, and for whatever reasons he chose to do this. So anyway, let's get back to this here. So, tracing a bygone race, transcribed from the July 6, 1896 edition of The Sun, New York, which I believe was a newspaper, daily newspaper, I think. Tracing a bygone race, Professor Bayer's explorations of the Louisiana mounds evidence of the existence of a prehistoric race. They were big men. the skeletons measuring more than 6 feet, but apparently not warlike. I find that very interesting that they're making that observation there. Maybe vegetarian or, mostly vegetarian, like non-warlike people in a more advanced culture. But, you'll get a different story today. So the Lardo Mounds excavation not complete. So I guess it's a follow-up article. Professor George Byer, curator of the Tulane Museum and professor of natural history in that institution, has returned from his investigation of the Indian mounds at Catahoula, which he has been conducting under the joint auspices of the university and the Louisiana Historical Society. The excavations, as far as they have gone, have been eminently successful. Professor Byer secured a large number of valuable archaeological specimens for the museum and brought out some of the interesting facts about the Louisiana Aborigines. But the work is by no means complete, and Professor Byer will soon go back to Catahoula and continue his explorations, which it is hoped will solve some of the important points concerning the mound builders not heretofore known. The mounds explored are 4 in number, recently discovered in Lake Lardo, in the swamp country of Catahoula. The mounds were thoroughly examined, but not content with this, Professor Byer explored the surrounding country and discovered scores of mounds throughout the swamp region of Catahoula and neighboring parishes. The town of Troyville is built over a score of these mounds, and a large number of the houses in that section are erected on mounds, which render them safe against overflow. The mounds are not high like those in Ohio and the central western states, and the reason why but little has been hitherto known concerning them is because the people living in the swamps were not aware that they were erected by human hands, but believed them to be natural high places in the swamp created by drift, etc. So they believed them to be naturally, and they're saying drift as it pertains to glaciation and when the glaciers receded and left this drift, which is not the right story, guys. It's something else. Okay. More harkens to Velikovsky and what happened to this continent. The Lake Lardo Mounds, perfect circles with connecting causeways between them, were so clearly artificial as to attract the notice of the people living in the neighborhood. The other mounds are more irregular in the outline or more hidden away in the swamps, and little or nothing has hitherto been known of them. They are larger than the Lardo mounds and may disclose more important relics. So there was these other mounds found that were larger than the Lardo mounds. What happened to them? More road fill, guys. Unfortunately. And all less than 100 years ago, guys. Just think about that. The mounds excavated have yielded a number of skeletons, crockery, arrowheads, mortars, and drills. They show that the mound builders were of kindred origin to the Indians, but they had lived and died in the Louisiana swamps in pre-Columbian times, so very early, and who knows how far back. Okay, there's no reason they don't know. As I say, the layering, the strata of soil in the geology of the Americas is different than anywhere else in the world. So it has to be an original interpretation no matter what. They can relate it to other places in the world in some strata in time periods that, may suggest these things precisely, but the strata in the Americas is different. It has to be read in a specific way, and whatever, according to them, it has to be new because it's the New World. The early French and Spanish settlers found no people living in these swamps, which before the days of houses extended from the Sicily Hills, island hills, to those east of the Yazoo Valley, including a region of 10,000 to 12,000 square miles. That's awfully big. The mounds were evidently erected as a protection against the high water of the Mississippi, which converted this vast region into a lake in olden times, and in old days must have appeared to be islands. When not a lake, the country was a swamp, which an enemy would have found it difficult to penetrate. The mound dwellers were large in size, many of the skeletons being over 6 feet high, and were evidently a powerful race, for the number of arrowheads and tomahawks show them to have been ill supplied with arms. So they were ill supplied with arms. They didn't have a lot of arms. Too busy farming, probably. The arrowheads of peculiar white flint came from some far distant place, probably from western Texas or New Mexico. So that's very interesting right there. Again, these ancient peoples were engaged with trade with other peoples from all over the continents there. Okay, they knew about each other, and therefore all sorts of ideas could be passed one way or another. All the indications are that these people were a semi-civilized tribe, more advanced than the Indian tribes of the eastern United States. They had moved east from Mexico and had finally been forced to seek refuge in the Louisiana swamps from the more savage and warlike Indians around them. And that's because the artifacts found in these mound areas are very similar to art style and mythical style of the Aztecs, Mayas, and other cultures from the Americas there. But that's an assumption on their part based on previous research and the lack of research done in the Americas. And the fact that these things appeared is very interesting. It said when the area is flooded and at that current time in this lake, they appeared as islands. Okay, so you find all these ancient cultures built, these megalithic constructions and other constructions in the mountainous regions all around the world. Okay, so what do you do when you're in a more or less flat area? What do you do with that? Well, you build your own mountains in the form of pyramids. The construction of the Lardo Mounds recalls the city of Mexico as Cortez saw it. They were once probably in the lake. They are now upon its very border, and it has sensibly shrunk in area in historical times, and were connected with each other by means of causeways as at Mexico. What style of habitation was built on them, it is impossible to say, for there are no relics save of ashes. And I find this very curious here because this was what was similarly found at Cahokia, okay? And it was attributed to some catastrophe in the past, and who knows when. Can't go by their time period, data, because it's all messed up. And this is something similar to having COVID. They attribute to some great catastrophe there. So what's the problem here? So, why were all these things reduced to ashes here? Well, I don't think that necessarily the catastrophe is what led to the end of Cahokia or this area either. I think the peoples there were probably exterminated, as which we know by the research we've done on this channel here. Places like Galena Canyon in New Mexico, where these people were genocided. Okay, not a very nice story for the Native Americans to be doing that, but it's okay for the Lovelock people. They got genocided by the Paiutes, and the Galena Canyon people got genocided by some ancestor of the peaceful Pueblo people there, and they can't have that. Okay, so because that gives the other nut jobs an excuse to say, well, see, they did genocide, so what's the big deal? We did it. So two wrongs don't make a right. You're wrong and you're wrong, both wrong. Okay, there's such a thing as being bad guy against bad guy, and that's how it is, folks. So there's places like Galena Canyon, which is not on any sort of national register of parks or anything for good reason. Okay, see my video on it on my channel. That's probably one of the most interesting and pertinent points of my research here on this channel. Out of C.W. Ceram's book, who wanted us to know about it. He felt it was suppressed, and it doesn't seem to be written about by any other alternative researchers anywhere or spoken about. Okay, so so we know they were reduced to ashes, whatever sort of structures were built on top there, but who's to say that those structures weren't built by some other race that occupied those areas? Because there's evidence of Adena and Hopewell-like cultures in the area as well. We'll get to that. The life of the people is easily told from their utensils. They were fishermen rather than hunters and used nets to catch their fish. So here we have this fishing culture, maritime culture, whatever it is, seems to be prevalent all around the United States. These cultures were just experts at this type of hunting and fishing and whatever it was. And fishing was a predominant way of doing things because the abundance of fish and the ability to catch them. There's evidence of all these ancient fishing weirs all along the coast of up and down the Americas. Okay, these ancient fishing weirs where these people went into the water and they drove the small fish that swam along the shoreline and even bigger fish into these weirs where they could be easily collected. Okay, it's like a little sort of dugout area in the sand area there where they drive these fish into it large enough to hold enough fish, and then the people standing by these weirs would gather up those fish in mass, like a major production going on there. They must have lived on these islands for centuries, for the soil and layers of ashes and fish bones prove this. When they died or how they died is not known, nor was there any tradition among the Indians concerning the swampers when the French came to Louisiana 2 centuries ago. When the further explorations to be made will reveal the identity and story of these Aborigines remains to be seen. It will only then be possible to determine when these swamp dwellers were the original inhabitants of the country driven out by the Indians or whether they came in later. What light these excavations will shed on archaeology and Aboriginal history remains yet to be seen. Well, no, it seems like there were much earlier, more advanced races there before the Native Americans got there, and then they were systematically wiped out. Okay, so they mentioned Troyville, which was this mound area, this one of the greatest mound areas in the United States. And here's some artist renderings of it. What it must have looked like shows these platform type mounds and that central mound that had this rather sharp angle here, somewhere between 45 and 90 degrees, I would imagine. But it's just interesting that this is the structure type that was built upon here. It seems very different than some of the other mound groups in the Americas here. And again, just an amazing site here. And you can see all the different mound works there, the enclosure wall. And unfortunately, folks, this was demolished in the 1930s during these WPA projects that were going on. And I'm sure with, Roosevelt's blessing, they did all this stuff. And at the time, Alois Hrdlicka, this lunatic, this loony, was in charge of things. And you can see by the expression on his face right here, the man was just a complete Looney Tune, and he was just out of his mind, and he chose to let this go on. He could have said something about it, he could have done something about it, but he didn't, and he didn't for a reason. He's a gatekeeper at the Smithsonian. He was a gatekeeper, and it just so happens that C.W. Ceram wrote about him being this in his book, and Charles C. Mann wrote about this fellow being that in his book. So just an unusual coincidence there that these two gentlemen who wrote these books, these authors, would put the same guy in there and talk about him because he was just a complete Looney Tune, off his rocker screwball, and ruined archaeology and heavily suppressed and probably destroyed a lot of these artifacts. I hate to say that, folks, but and they're going to not admit to it. Like Dr. Ken Fader said, he said, "Oh, I have some friends at the Smithsonian, and they said nothing happened." So, it's just like, word of mouth, second hand, third hand, whatever it is. They don't know. They live today. They don't know what happened back then under the reign of Alice Herdlish until the 1940s when he more or less got kicked out because he didn't believe that there was habitations in the Americas beyond like 4,000 years ago, and he was just not going to buy into anybody's story. But when actual excavations revealed these habitation, proof of habitation beyond that, he had to eat his shorts. So it's just funny. Here we see more of a barrow type mound found in the area in this old illustration here. And here's a more an article about the mound works there at Troyville. And here's the illustration of it, and it just is identical to any sort of bell barrel or bowl barrel mound that you would find the Adena or the Hopewell buried in. Okay, and here's an old map of the complex with the wall enclosure against the river, so that's done for security reasons. Okay, you don't need to do it along the river, and this is a place where they're occupied here at the time, the settlers area along the river. Okay, so it's against the river here where, goods and material could be shipped for the people living there at the time of settlers and for the time that these ancient peoples lived there. Both, see? And there's a lot of canals down there in Louisiana, as we know through the research of John Jensen. So anyway, here it is. I can't blow them up because they took them away for some reason. I don't know. They're not there. I can't make them larger for you for some reason. And let me read to you what happened here. Before it was destroyed for a bridge approach fill in 1931, Troyville was one of the most impressive mound groups in North America. The site is at the confluence of the Quachita, Tensas, and Little Rivers. It contained 9 mounds and a perimeter embankment. William Dunbar of the Hunter-Dunbar expedition sent out by Thomas Jefferson described the site in its pristine state in 1804. A great mound, Mound 5, at 82 feet high, was the tallest mound in Louisiana and one of the largest in North America. 8 smaller platform mounds were about 12 feet tall and 150 by 60 feet at the base. The embankment was 10 feet high and 100 feet across. That's mighty wide. It doesn't sound like, I don't know. It says across, not wide, but 10 feet high, 100 feet across. I guess across the whole area there. 100 feet doesn't sound very big to me. Sounds more, did they mean the width? This is a modern article from, some archaeological website down in Louisiana. I don't know. You trying to obfuscate that at all? I don't know. The Great Mound had been reduced to a height of 50 feet by Civil War times, and Smithsonian archaeologist Winslow Walker excavated it in 1931 and 1932 in haste. In haste. They're neglecting to mention that. They're just leaving that out a little bit there because they had to build this bridge there. And they did the excavation in haste. And I'm sure Alice Herdlish's thought on it, who was in charge at the time, probably thought That was no big deal that they would extract all the evidence and artifacts and data that they could possibly glean from it. So it didn't matter if it was destroyed. They had everything they needed from it. And then, what became of all this stuff? This stuff is just must fit in a huge, gigantic warehouse of the stuff. I mean, the stuff that they have fits in a giant warehouse. So, just the stuff found alone from the mounds could be fit in a giant warehouse. Where is it? It's gone. Well, thanks to this guy, probably all destroyed. And so, any case, guys, this is what happened to it, okay? You uncovered woven cane matting, palmetto fronds, and wooden planks within the mound, evidence of the complex engineering used to build this 8,700 mound. Its modest remains are on Willow Street and 2nd Street. Another mound is visible near Front Street and 2nd Street, while the embankment can be seen at Willard Street and Front Street. Troyville is listed on the National Register of Historic Places now, after the whole thing's been destroyed, more or less. But, that's only after they had to use it for film. And that was Alice Hurdliska, and he's still a well-respected man in Smithsonian circles. For what reason, I have no idea. But who knows what, what actual archaeology. Can't touch it now. So, we don't know. But to me, the evidence of the barrow-style mounds there would be evidence of it. And, some people like the Adena or the Hopewell there. And these barrow mounds, and the reason I'm calling them barrow mounds, they don't call them mounds. They call them, round or whatever. But they're not. They're more like these Bell Beaker mounds, Bell Beaker culture mounds found in Europe. They just so happen to find very tall skeletal remains with vaulted craniums, with vaulted skulls, similar to that, to the Adena. I did a video about it on my channel. They're like cousins, okay, in the structure of their skeletal remains, okay, except that the Bell Beaker people were slightly smaller than the Adena, and their craniums were slightly smaller, but still huge, but slightly smaller, and the Adena were just bigger than those people, and from a time period that seemed to overlap, okay, according to, geologists and archaeologists. But in my mind, it sort of says that maybe the cultures from the Americas went to Europe. Remember, maybe the origination point of the peoples, the Bell Beaker peoples, was the Americas, and they have their movements all completely wrong. And since everybody was traveling around by boat in the past, that we can pretty much assure ourselves now that the Smithsonian has said that, the whatever people, whoever they were, that came across during, supposed ice age or whatever, were coming by boat, well, then anybody could have come by boat at any time, right? So that's their research. That's what their research shows. And it, like I said in my video, a couple of videos back, it just opens a huge can of worms for them. So then if they came, then anybody came at any time. Ding dong. All right. Winsboro, Louisiana, 12-foot giants, and that's awfully big. And, it was these 12-foot giants who had, 40-inch circumference around the skulls there. Just, whew, God. J.R. Tolkien. Winsboro, Louisiana, 12-foot giants. Fine giant skeletons. In life, they average 12 feet in height. Winsboro, Louisiana. Skeletons of a race of giants who averaged 12 feet in height were found by workmen engaged on a drainage project at Crowville near here. There are several score at least of the skeletons, and they lie in various positions. It is believed that they were killed in a prehistoric fight and that the bodies lay where they fell until covered with alluvial deposits due to the flooding of the Mississippi River. Okay, guys, so again, alluvial deposits, that means in gravel. Okay, so we found so many of these burials with these rather large ones, these ones that seem to be 10 and 12 feet in height, or even 8 footers and 9 footers or whatever. But, it seems to be a lot of these rather large skeletons are either buried in these gravel pits or in vaults of some sort, or in caves of some sort, or whatever it is, or little stone sarcophagus and wooden sarcophagus. They seem to be these, but these ones that are buried in gravel, which we saw in so many different states, may refer to a specific time period, a specific, ritual burial in these alluvial deposits, which could have been added to, where they could have taken deposit from anywhere along the river and added to it to create these, gravel mounds in which these 12-foot skeletons just so happen to be buried in everywhere they seem to be finding these things, with no artifacts either to go along with any things often recorded with these gravel pit burials. No weapons of any sort were found, and it's believed that the Titans must have struggled with wooden clubs. So maybe if they had any or whatever, they had weapons, just weren't buried with them. Can't make that assumption. It's ridiculous. The skulls are in a perfect state of preservation, and something about the jawbones are large enough to something a baby's body. So you see, to cover a whole baby's body. So it was a giant skull, like I said, those 40-inch circumference. And just, again, the reason why I'm singling this one out is because the gravel burial, the gravel mound burials, the gravel hill burials, alluvial burials, you wouldn't know that if you were a layman reading the paper back then. I'm sure, I don't think it gives a date, actually a year, but let's see, does it say? No. So it's hard to say when this was taken from. Probably, early 20th century, late 19th century seems to be when this whole thing really took root. And people went crazy, just stealing and looting and doing all kinds of Smithsonian destroying. They just didn't care. And certainly during the WPA projects, we heard over and over again, like the Tennessee Valley, like up at Candlewood Lake, where right by Mallory, where I did my research at the Stonewall area there. The whole, all these places, more or less destroyed or covered, for public works projects, progress, etc. And it just, burying the past one way or another, and just knowing, nobody cared about it. Certainly not this jerk, this lunatic jerkwad here. Him and his buddy Holmes that had the position before him or somewhere in between, but this guy was a punk. Big punk. Okay, Lark Lake, 7-footers, and even 7-footers are big, guys. Just remember that one fraction of the 1% of tall people on this planet are 7 foot or better. A fraction, and even in the NBA, it's rare to be 7 foot tall players or over. So it's not like something today. They say, "Oh, it's no big deal. We got people today." Yeah, in a fraction of numbers, it's a rare occurrence. Doofus. What do you think, we're stupid? Goony goo goos. Slightly more robust. Knuckleheads. Search reveals huge skeletons of extinct race. Mound in Louisiana gives up bones of Indians more than 7 feet tall. Natchez, Mississippi. This is where it comes from, Skeletons of Indians estimated to have been more than 7 feet tall have been unearthed by explorers of Catahoula Parish, Louisiana. A search for locations for study by members of the Smithsonian Institution. Get them away from there. What does it take? Garlic, crosses, whatever it is, like vampires. Smithsonian Institution disclosed from 15 to 20 of the skeletons in a grave on a mound at Larder Lake. The discovery was made by Dr. E. A. Beidhaupt and E. W. Knight and was regarded as contributing to the theory that the prehistoric mound builder once lived there, which was soon to be put an end to. And I don't think they give a date here for this one either, but it's an Associated Press article at the time. And just to show you, the Smithsonian had its claws on this thing, but even at a time where it was maybe more innocent and they were just discovering all these things before they developed some sort of policy on it, and you saw all these legitimate discoveries, probably legitimate research. I mean, we hear about it. There was probably reams and reams and reams of detailed notes, etc. Where is all this stuff? You know, and where can we see it? What what do you got? So not well known, and probably on purpose. Tangapoa Giants, the New Orleans Picayune on Wednesday, as the follows. At Tanganoa last week, laborers making an excavation dug up several human skeletons of such enormous size that speculations are ripe as to which era the remains of such giant forms may belong. The skulls are described as being of double the size of an ordinary skull, and the several bones being in proportion equally as large. In all probability, the remains are those of some Indians buried many centuries previous to the discovery of this continent. So, just another one from the Picayune. So, of such enormous size, speculation are ripe as to which era the remains of such giant forms may belong. Well, that's still up for debate today. Okay, so I think that was it for Louisiana. Only had 4 accounts, but as I say, it's the details in these things that seem very interesting, and just to, reinforce again and again, that in every state in the United States, these accounts occurred, and these, archaeological finds and Smithsonian involved with so many of them, and no sort of admittance by them as to what this is all about. Just what we're offered is sort of like a children's story about it. The Nahalo. So we're there. We're in Mississippi now. I was here for Louisiana, just a couple of counts. So let's do Mississippi now. The Nahalo. The Choctaws preserve a dim tradition that after crossing the Mississippi, they met a race of men called the Nahalo, tall in stature and of fair complexion, whom had migrated from the sunrise. They had once been a mighty people, but were then few in number, and soon disappeared after the incoming of the Choctaws. This race of men, according to tradition, tillers of the soil and peaceable. So you see that right there. Tillers of the soil and peaceable. Okay? The vegetarians that were intelligent and peaceable with not a lot of weapons. Okay? Maybe that came later with the hybridization of these people, of these large peoples. Okay? This is a long story, guys, that stretches back millennia. Okay, long time periods for all these different cultures to develop and pass and everything else. Okay, and their dating is wrong and everything else. So this could be going on from the Pleistocene era. So this was in the this book here, Mississippi Province, Territory, and State Biographical Notice of Eminent Citizens. So this is where it was taken from. Okay, the accounts from the Choctaws about these people that came before them, but when they arrived were still here, They were fair in complexion, and they were once mighty, but then when they were few in number, because they were dying out. They were dying from gravity sickness. Okay, very interesting um, phrase there that I figured out where I got it from. I got it from this science fiction book I read. It was great. I can't remember the name of it now, but the Earth's rotation slowed down, and there was like 3 days of light and 3 days of dark, and just screwed up everything. And people were getting what they call gravitation sickness or gravity sickness because everything was changing. Interesting sci-fi book if you like sci-fi. I just can't remember the name of that book. I'll find it. Mound builders and the swastika. Now this one is very interesting here, and you can even see even way back when, 100 years ago or better. I don't think this is dated here, but it's either late Victorian or early 20th century, something like that, from what they say. Mound builders and the swastika, the oldest mystery. Excuse me, folks. Gotta take a drink. Okay, so this is very interesting. Swastika is so familiar to us here in the Southwest. Is the oldest symbol in the world. Also, it is the oldest mystery. You find it engraved on primitive tools dug up in the mounds of the Ohio, Tennessee, and Mississippi mound builders who inhabited America before the Indians. The swastika also is found in the most ancient ruins of Alaska, Mexico, Brazil, Egypt, Babylonia, China, Japan, India, Assyria, Phoenicia, Persia, Tibet, Greece, and nearly every other country in the world, including obscure islands. Buddha, according to myth, carved the swastika in the soles of his sandals, and oriental statues of him often have their feet decorated to correspond. The swastika is the international symbol for good, luck, and general welfare, like our horseshoe. The Negro's rabbit foot, you have to excuse this article, people. It came from a long time ago. And the Chung Meng Fui Goi sign that is painted on the door of nearly every Chinese home. The swastika's origin is unknown, but archaeologists with the ditch diggers of science have traced it back to the beginning of the Bronze Age, 4,500 years ago. For all we know, the swastika may have been old then. How did it spread over the earth and become known in countries that are supposed to have had no knowledge of each other in ancient times? That's my question. Christopher Columbus unquestionably knew the swastika, possibly had it painted on his ships for luck, yet marked that it was used by the mound builders in America centuries before Columbus was born. How did they get it? The only plausible explanation of the universal use of the swastika comes from China. The Chinese, who claimed that their explorer Fu Sang visited America 1,060 years before Columbus, believed that civilization travels in an endless wave, up 30,000 years, then down 30,000 years, so on forever. That's why Chinese mythology tells of flying men far back in antiquity. The Earth may be 1,700,000,000 years old, says Professor William Duane of the Harvard Medical School. He bases his calculation on radioactivity. Regardless of the number of years, clear things are buried back there in the past, and shown by the swastika, oldest mystery, the Albuquerque Herald. So here's an article from evidently times of airplanes and radioactivity by way of Madame Curie or Marie Curie. They sort of known about. So it must have been the early 20th century or late 19th century this article comes from. And here we see, so the Nazis are not even around at this time. So it's a symbol for good luck and all this kind of stuff that, now that we can't have or put anywhere. And because, the Nazis did it all in as a bad thing. But evidently the symbol has great power and should be studied, but, you're not allowed to, I guess. It's verboten, which is a shame. But so many people mention it on their channels, Sylvia goes through it. Robert Shepard goes through it on his channel. A number of other people, even I think a lot of mainstream people have mentioned it at one time or another in their videos. Okay, so here's another very interesting one. Silver sword scabbards, iron knives, and Hebrew inscriptions. Okay, so here's the article here. And again, what these people take for Hebrew inscriptions, I'm going to do a separate video on it. I just got to. I'm not even going to get into it here. But Hebrew isn't Hebrew, folks. It's a type of Phoenician language. Okay? Phoenician. It started getting called as Proto-Hebrew or Paleo-Hebrew, at least the type of Hebrew they're talking about here. At some later in the 50s by somebody who's like, we're just calling it that, and that's all there is to it. Okay, so as old as others, evidence that America is not a new world. Okay, so and you see, very interesting here at this time, this article was written. This is what people were saying, and for good reason. It's not like they want to make us think it was like there's no good reason why anybody should think this, but it's ridiculous, and their logic is fallacious because, it's not that because ha ha ha, that's not reasoning. It's just, this is a type of fallacious reasoning. Recent research goes to show that the civilization of Mississippi mound builders was coeval with that of the ancient Orientals. We are so accustomed to think of America as the New World, says the London Spectator, that the assertion of a recent writer that America is an old world and compares well with other countries in this respect comes upon the reader with something of a shock. But when we find how lavishly the remains of prehistoric races are scattered over the length and breadth of the North American continent, we realize that ancient monuments are no more numerous on this than on any other side of the Atlantic. And when we consider the works left by those lost races, we are constrained to admit that the prehistoric relics of America are as interesting as any yet discovered within our own borders. The American archaeologist is, it is true, confronted with a great and peculiar difficulty. His continent is covered with remains of prehistoric races, but historic time for him begins at least no earlier than the landing of Columbus, and the mystery which must always envelop a people who have so little in the way of written records commences for him but 4 centuries ago. On the other hand, we have clear evidence that some of the early inhabitants were contemporary with the mammoth and the mastodon, and in South America, at any rate, remains of cliff-dwelling races are associated with the bones of no fewer than 44 animals now entirely extinct. Many interesting notices, more or less fragmentary, have from time to time appeared relative to the wonderful architectural relics of the cliff dwellers of the Colorado and the no less wonderful pyramids and earthworks of the mound builders of the Mississippi. But the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America has been marked, among other things, by the publication of one volume of all that has yet been made known of the mound builders, a volume of which it is not too much to say that is one of the most interesting of all archaeological records. When the relics of this vanished race first began to attract attention some 40 years ago, it was thought that the silver sword scabbards, iron knives, and Hebrew inscriptions then brought to light were traces of a highly civilized, quote, people who had migrated from some historic country, unquote. Latterly, the current of opinion has been tending quite the other way, and some authorities appear to think that the real mound builders, who had nothing to do with the modern implements which had been intruded among their remains, were after all mere savages. But it is the view of many eminent American antiquarians that these early races, mound builders, cliff dwellers, and others, coeval with them, constituted a cultus which differed essentially from any other now known to history. Okay, so wasn't that an interesting article there? And what the take on it is from an early time here. Okay, an honest look at these things. It all got botched up with the policy during the reigns of Holmes and Herdlischka, and this whole effort to suppress all of this, okay, based on their cockamamie theories, whether it be the Ice Age, Darwinian theory, or whatever, dating techniques, strata techniques, which they didn't understand until later times, okay? It's been revised 100 times already. And as I said, with the Smithsonian, the reason they had to change their thinking from the Bering Strait crossing to them crossing by boat is because everywhere they dug, they couldn't find evidence of their theory. You see? So people have been dealing with the Bering Strait theory for how many years now? 100 years or whatever it is, and it's ridiculous. It's nonsense. It's bogus. And I'm sure anybody you find on the street right now, today, unless they read that article in the Smithsonian Magazine, that's what they're going to think. They're going to be living in their nice little historical fantasy world. The most abundance in mound builder relics. Relics in the Mississippi Valley. The works of the mound builders are most abundant in the Mississippi Valley. They are found, it is true, in other parts of the continent, but nowhere else do they occur in such profusion or in such magnitude. From the Red River to Florida, from the Alleghenies to the Rocky Mountains, the whole ground is strewn with their remains. In Ohio alone, there are 10,000 mounds for burial or for foundations of dwellings, and more than 1,500 enclosures surrounded with earthen works. Some of the mounds are acres in extent. Monk's Mound, the great tumulus of Cahokia near St. Louis, rises by 4 platforms to a height of 100 feet and covers 16 acres of ground. Some tribes, evidently hunters by occupation, using tools and weapons made of unsmelted copper and meteoritic iron, have left, in addition to the ordinary conical mounds, huge earthen effigies, not only of beasts of the chase, elk and moose, wolf and panther, goose and wild duck, but of hawks and swallows, snakes and tadpoles. One such figure of a serpent is nearly 500 yards long. Other tribes, apparently more warlike, have left earthen walls, some which are still 30 feet high, and enclose as much as 400 acres of ground. The actual mounds, which are so numerous, served in many cases for burial, and some were used by successive races. So these are these secondary burials. So here's where a lot of confusion came in the past, and even in contemporary times. So it's all new, folks. I'm sorry to say. What they think they know. They always have to appear like they know a lot of stuff, see? Or they have no credibility. So in instances, whatever they want to do is, make up their own story, whatever it is. That's what they're going to do. To appear, that they're not ignorant in these areas. So, that's bad for business. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that in regular business. The minute a salesman looks incompetent, well, he doesn't have the sale. and they're selling this, you see, just like they're selling a car. Of two mounds in the same group, one contained a skeleton of a medicine man with a modern looking glass, perhaps not 50 years old, in his hand. Another mound in the group contained a skeleton of a child with a string of beads on its wrist and a pot of sweetmeats at his head, while trees with at least 3 centuries' growth were growing in the ground above. That these structures have been used by successive races is well illustrated by a mound in Illinois, in which, lying underneath recent Indian interments, was the skeleton of some long-forgotten Jesuit pioneer with a rosary of Venetian beads about its waist and a silver crucifix still in its bony hand. How interesting is that? That's cuckoo. There must have been several entirely different races of mound builders, judging from the wide differences in the style and materials of their works. In the upper part of the Mississippi Valley, the mounds are mainly burial places. In Wisconsin, many are in the shape of animals. In other districts, the mounds contain chambers roofed with logs. The Gulf states are remarkable for their earthen pyramids. At one point on the lower Mississippi is a group of 8, one of which covers 6 acres of ground. Its size corresponds to the points of the compass and is surrounded by a ditch 10 feet deep. Okay, so this is the Record Union, September 9th, 1893, and just so interesting a story, and often the kind of ideas that are discussed on this channel. And here you see these people from an ancient, from a past, 100-year-old past at least, in the late Victorian period there, had the same sort of ideas. They were no less intelligent as we are right now, okay? And since everything is hypothesis and theory, any sort of, analysis and perception of it is good to go. Gigantic proportions in Jackson County, ruins and traditions. On the eastern shore of Pascagoula Bay in Jackson County, Mississippi, near its mouth are the ruins of an ancient fortification, built apparently many centuries ago. It appears to have been constructed chiefly of seashells. Within this ruin, several feet below the surface, have been found charred coals and fragments of a peculiar kind of earthenware, together with many human bodies. Among them were discovered parts of a human skeleton of gigantic proportions. The upper part of the skull was said to be sufficiently large to fit loosely over the largest modern heads. All historical traces of the origin of this fortress have long disappeared. There is, however, a tradition still extant amongst, and the end of article, the Polynesian, Honolulu, Hawaii, 2nd January 1841, chronicling America. And so this is an archaeological site, so even by 1841, the remnants of this were just barely seen. And whenever they say this, with charred coals and fragments of a peculiar kind of earthenware, well, who knows what kind of peculiar kind of earthenware, but we know about this stuff involved with the agriculture of the people in these societies, who often were said were, hunter-gatherers, again with the hunter-gatherer nonsense. And about this midden, okay, this is in ancient farming concepts, techniques, etc., okay, and just so many of these things are talked about here. And there's some JSTOR articles about it, and written explorations of this, and written about so much. Okay, so it's creating the kind of conditions for bad soil by adding charcoal and fragmented pottery, which retains moisture in it. Okay, and I couldn't help by thinking up by Jimmy, where his property is, that maybe they included certain kinds of stone when they didn't have pottery to add these, and in Charles C. Mann's book, he had said there were areas of just hundreds of square acres of this midden, which was all this charcoal and broken pottery. It's I see the same thing reported in these accounts again and again in these societies that mainstream had claimed for so long were not agricultural societies. Well, I think the evidence of it is there, and with their story they give us, it's a bunch of nonsense. More nonsense from them. It's just a whole story of the past is a bunch of nonsense. Okay, guys, so that's it. I think that's it for these articles here. Believe I got to every single one. And if I didn't, no biggie, but very interesting accounts, very inexplicable things in these areas. Again, hard to make sense of all these things, but when you read some of these accounts from the past, you get a sort of they were, observing these areas when they were pristine, before the Civil War, etc., so these accounts have to be taken as legitimate, and, look, again, as I suggest to everybody again and again on the channel, you make of it what you want. We've gone over these things on the channel so many times with going through this series on the quote-unquote giants or large hominids that, this is just a totally suppressed story of archaeology here in North America, and there's good reason for that. And as I was mentioning to Jimmy today when I was talking about him, about the radio show, that the conversation we had on the radio earlier today, that there's a bigger story here. So in any case, guys, that's it. That's all she wrote, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like button kindly if you would, and I will be back with another video probably on the giants in South Dakota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Okay, I think you can put those two together. It's not a lot of accounts, but again, just showing it's just accounts of the quote-unquote giants or large hominids in every state of the union, folks. All right, guys, Bugcat7 signing off. Peace.